So far we haven't talked about any vertical shifting, and we haven't talked about the amplitude changes where it's taller or shorter. All we're doing right here is looking at how the period plays a role. Again, no horizontal shifting yet either. And so the first thing that you're going to do when you are trying to set up and sketch these graphs is you have to find what its period is. Okay? And so to do that, we're taking 2 pi divided by whatever the multiplier of x is. So the multiplier in front of x is 4. So we see that the period is going to be pi over 2. And that means that this graph is going to repeat every pi over 2. Okay? So since it's a sine graph, is it going to start at the minimum, maximum, or midline? We know it starts at the midline, and since there's no horizontal shifting, we know it can be the origin. So I'm going to plot this point first. Next, I'm going to plot the point pi over 2. And now, when I look at this graph, some of the times it depends. I included this one specifically so I could talk through and explain it. But sometimes the graph, it's hard to see what each of the tick marks represent. So I include what it represents up here. And you can kind of look and see pi over 16, but it's harder to see what these other tick marks represent. So if I have a period of pi over 2, in terms of if each of these grid marks represents 16ths, what is pi over 2 in terms of 16ths? It's going to be 8, right? So what that means is I can count over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. My graph is going to repeat. So it's going to start the second period at this point. So I can plot that point as well. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the general tendencies of my graph. So remember, I'm going to cut this in half. So here's half. I'm going to cut each of those in half. So here are my critical points that I'm going to plot. And then with the sine graph, we start at the midline, then go to maximum, midline, minimum, midline. So my sketch looks like this, right? And when I use the correct graph here, so again, the one that has the midline and the maximum is my sine graph. So if I choose that as my graphing utility, and I plot the midline and this point here, the maximum, it will sketch the full graph for you. So if you take 2 pi, divide by the multiplier in front of x, that gives you period of pi over 3. Right? In this particular case, in terms of, since each grid mark represents 24ths, what would your numerator have to be? So it turns out that this one did use the same 8. Okay, so I'm going to count 8 units over. Well, first of all, I'm going to plot my first point. So I have a cosine. There's no shifting involved. So my cosine begins with a maximum. Okay, and then as I shift over, 8 24ths, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm also going to have a point here. And if you look down, you should be able to see that you're dealing with pi over 3. Again, it's somewhat hard to tell. You can see it in there, but it's easier just to count it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this in half, cut each of those halves in half, and that's going to give me my critical points. So I go maximum, midline, minimum, midline, maximum. And so by plotting these points right here, just one period, the graphing utility will complete the rest. And even though, again, that this is the cosine function, even though it marks it as a min and a max, it just needs to be the extrema. So if you start with this point and then plot this point, it will complete that graph for you.